Hello everyone and welcome to yet another day in this the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today, we're just going to have to go through just how Kemi Badenoch is terrible at her job. And I, again, am going to have to basically remind myself that I thought she was going to be the next Thatcher 3 years ago. And now that is looking like one of the most moronic predictions ever made by man. So for the past few weeks, Kemi Badenoch has basically been doing basic PR work, going around to BAE Systems in Glasgow, for instance, to talk to people about naval defence. She's with the farmers usually, things like that. Just basic politician stuff. Stuff that Robert Jenrick is doing as well, but better, I'll put it that way. Anyway, yesterday she then decided that she was going to tease that there's actually going to be policy announced, which she was avoiding for some time. Through the grapevine you hear it's basically because she's lazy and doesn't actually do anything before she has her steak sandwich at 12 o'clock. In fact, she is renowned for having terrible timekeeping, to the point where her aide said that they have to work on Kemi Badenoch time because she lives in her own time zone. Anyway, here was the little teaser.
So here is what we are going to do. We are going to rewrite the rules of the game.
Just going to talk over it at this point. You get what's going on. I'd say a big problem that the Tories have at the moment is that they are this still looks all very inauthentic. It almost looks too professional, if you know what I mean. I mean, Reform throw out things like this, fancily edited PR stunts and things like that. But at the same time, they will also record off-the-cuff speeches on their phone on the way to Parliament whenever they are where they are. Whereas you basically never get that from Kemi Badenoch. Everything looks a bit too professionalised, inauthentic, airbrushed, if you will, so it just makes people not take her seriously. Anyway, as you saw, she was announcing that a speech will be made today, in fact, at 10:30. That speech is now over. And guess what? We're going to quickly go through it, because I'm just kind of amazed at how bad she is, I'll put it that way. So, take it away, Kemi. I mean, already, it's not great, is it? It's a bit of a lacklustre clap. The energy you would typically expect from a party leader who's announcing a complete change of direction of the party for the better, you'd expect a bit more enthusiasm. But we didn't get any. Anyway, here we go.
We are living off the inheritance of previous generations.
Already trying to make the boomer vote happy. That is effectively the fiction that they will push forward, and then completely ignore that our second highest spending commitment is to pay for boomer pensions. The first is for the NHS, which again will be mostly used by boomers because they're at that age where they need to go to the hospital for their bad ankles and things like that. Mostly built through the late 90s and 2000s on effectively debt. And who's had to pay off that debt? It's Nick, 30. And this is why a lot of young people are looking to move abroad.
For 3 centuries, every era in our country's history left a better legacy for its children. We are a wealthy country, but we are becoming weaker through complacency. We are losing our resilience. We can't make things like we used to. We don't build as quickly.
All very good points. The problem that you are always going to run into, especially when you have a shadow cabinet, where 22 out of the 23 of that shadow cabinet were in the cabinet of the last government under Rishi Sunak, is effectively you're going to get questions of, why didn't you do anything then? And that's pretty much what this video is going to be. In fact, oddly enough, it was Liz Truss's government that sounds most like what Kemi Badenoch is trying to say here, and at the same time, they can't really riff on that too much because Liz Truss is just walking electoral cancer at this point. Now, basically, every Tory threw her under the bus, so, again, how are we supposed to take you seriously? Anyway, we'll skip all the introduction now and get into the meat and potatoes, so to speak.
And now Labour are back, and they are already making everything worse. Jobs are disappearing, taxes are rising, and growth is shrinking. They are vandalising education, and they are completely clueless on the need for real reform of regulation.
I mean, once again, yes, Labour are definitely worse than the Tories in a lot of ways. But then the question really does need to be asked, why are you not preparing traps for them, essentially? I suppose actually a Tory outlook would be, oh, well, you don't really need to set traps for Labour because they end up just shooting themselves in the foot, which is definitely what has been happening under Starmer. But I'm trying to avoid sounding like a broken record here. All of this stuff was predictable. Why didn't you do anything about it? Every time I'm going to say that, I'm just going to skip over the clip, to be quite frank with you, so we're probably only going to end up watching about 2 minutes of this, but either way, it should show you how bad Kemi Badenoch is as a speaker.
Our party cannot shortcut our way back into office with easy answers or rushed announcements.
Well, from the sounds of it, Kemi, you won't be rushing anything, so I won't worry too much about that. However, it has been a complaint since Kemi was voted in as leader that basically nobody has any idea what the direction of the party is actually going to be, which I suppose was the point of this announcement, but, well, let's see how good the policies she has in mind are.
Let's start by telling the truth on energy and net zero.
Now, to be absolutely fair here, I keep seeing a lot of posts on Twitter saying, oh, but she always voted for all this stuff. You actually look at her voting record into environmental issues, it's actually relatively, well, more my side of things, we'll say, against biodiversity, against improving environmental water quality, against increasing windfall tax on oil and gas companies, against preservation of environmental protections, against regulation for fracking, etc, etc, etc. She's actually rather been on the good side of these things when it comes to the actual vote where the whip wasn't enforced. The problem is that people don't really care about that, and her rhetoric for years was always in support of net zero because, well, that was the party line. And so I suppose you can say that there is some genuine authenticity behind this claim that she's going to be against net zero.
Every single thing we do in our daily lives is dependent on cheap, abundant energy. When energy became cheap and abundant, living standards began to rise.
Yeah, that's true. That was all done through coal extraction in the 19th century, obviously a bit into the 20th as well. And generally then we moved more over to oil and gas, and now obviously we don't do that at all because we're supposed to get it all from wind and solar. Turns out they're not that great.
The cost of electricity, far too high, much higher than nearby and comparative countries, with the real possibility that it's going even higher still with environmental levies.
Yeah, I'd specifically cite Ed Miliband's own marking of his own homework that I went through a few months ago. Maybe the Tory party don't have analysers with as much free time as me, I suppose, so they pay them. But you actually go through that report, and in every scenario, apart from if Russia go gung-ho and start taking Poland or something like that, net zero actually makes prices even more expensive than if you did nothing and carried on with oil and gas. In every scenario apart from worst case where Russia go nuts. So I find it odd that they didn't take advantage to cite that, but as I say, they might not even know about it because their researchers simply don't have the same mind as me, who does this in his free time.
Conservatives like Margaret Thatcher have always been custodians of our natural environment.
Now this is true, she did bring up climate change back in the 80s, but I do just find it embarrassing. This isn't the first time she's mentioned Thatcher in this speech, by the way, I'm just cutting a lot of it out. But it is embarrassing how they have to keep citing Margaret Thatcher as who they want to emulate, and every single Prime Minister or Conservative Prime Minister since Thatcher, and every leader since Thatcher, has failed to actually emulate her. In fact, if anything, David Cameron, as popular as he was, before the whole Brexit thing, was probably emulating it in the complete opposite direction, where, his austerity was actually just tax and spend, but pretending it wasn't. And then bringing in gay marriage, which was the opposite of Section 28.
Ed Miliband's Climate Change Act 2008, no plan. And then in 2019, Parliament legislated for net zero by 2050, but no plan. A multi-trillion-pound, 30-year project touching every single aspect of all our lives was decided in 90 minutes without a single vote.
Couple of things there. One, when Labour do anything, she points out who did it. It's like, Labour, Ed Miliband, you know Ed Miliband? Bad. When the Tories did something like in 2019, it's, oh, the government put out the legislation. It's one of those things that's just very easy to see through, and it only touches upon the elephant in the room, which, as I say, is the, why didn't you do anything about all this for the years you were in Parliament? Oh, it's because you were making it worse. And also the claim that there's no plan, but there was trillions of pounds put into this project. It sounds like there was a bit of a plan there. May have been half-baked and terrible, but there was a plan.
Of the 22 MPs who spoke that day, only 2 sounded notes of caution. I was one of them. I asked for the plan. I asked for it that day. I asked for it many days after. 840 days later, a plan came, and it wasn't enough.
I mean, she is making the point that it took, what's that, nearly 3 years to actually come up with a plan for this net zero change. Fine, but once again, she was in the cabinet this whole time. It's not like Kemi Badenoch was some backbencher here, you know? It does make you wonder what is going on in the cabinet for that to happen, and if you believe Dominic Cummings, it's effectively, Kemi Badenoch included here, they're all just NPCs who are given a script, and they can't ask questions or actually have discussions. And it sounds like, well, this will be the result of it.
So please don't be fooled, and certainly don't be fooled by other parties' rhetoric.
Pardon me, half of this speech has been you saying, here's where mistakes have been made, here's where I was actually going against it. Are you saying don't trust me when I said in the past I was for net zero because it was for party line? Is that what we're saying now? Like, it's obviously a little bit of a dig at possibly both Labour and Reform, but I would imagine it's a bit of a dig at Reform because, frankly, they all are all rhetoric at the moment because they kind of have to be. But my God, when you are known as the party generally that is seen as untrustworthy by an awful lot of people, don't say don't trust other parties' rhetoric. Especially when you've just admitted that your rhetoric for the last few years has effectively led to no plan and a worse state of affairs in Britain.
I remember Nick Clegg dismissing the idea of building new nuclear because it would not come online until 2022.
Yes, I go on about that a lot as well. That was under a coalition government. Again, the Tories could have done something about that.
And new parties will turn up, like Reform, who don't have real answers to our country's challenges. That's why their energy policy fell apart right after they announced it.
I mean, I'll be fair, the comms on that energy policy were pretty shocking, I will give them that. But I did a whole video on it, it's not as bad as initially thought, but it could definitely do with some improvement.
Let me give you 3 truths at the heart of net zero. First, the published plans are completely muddled. It is true that the UK has made the greatest progress on carbon emissions in the developed world. Yet we are only responsible for 1% of global emissions.
Yep, we have halved our emissions since our peak emissions, which are actually way back in like the 1950s or something like that. And yeah, the only question is what's that led to? Higher energy bills. Probably wasn't worth it for most people.
Dealing with these challenges, Labour play rhetorical games, talking about missions, goals, and mistaking press releases about GB Energy for actual solutions. The real reason no one in their government is talking about a proper overall plan is that they know it would reveal just how catastrophic the actual costs will be. Again,
a decent attack on Labour, I'd say. It is true they don't really know what to do about net zero, and anything they do try and do is just going to make the situation worse. There was even talks from Labour sources, let's say, that effectively the only experienced minister they have in the cabinet at the moment is Ed Miliband, and he's the absolute worst person to know what he's doing to get stuff done for Labour's next chance to actually win Parliament, because they're entirely aware that heading towards net zero is just mental. But Ed Miliband has this crazy idea that he is going to be the saviour of climate catastrophe, so expect worse. You know, he met Greta Thunberg, so he's going to go nuts on this.
Second, even where there is a plan, we are behind. Let's look at one easy example. By 2040, the Committee on Climate Change says more than half of UK homes need to rip out their boilers and replace them with a heat pump.
And she goes into detail on how that's about 17 million homes, and so far only 300,000 have been swapped out. I will say, as this project ramps up, you can actually improve that rate, but it's still ridiculous, still expensive, and probably not worth it in the end. Especially if our energy generation is still mostly from gas anyway. You're replacing a gas boiler to have a heat pump, heat your home using electricity made by gas miles away instead. It's just not necessarily worth it.
Which brings me to the third truth. We are massively exposing ourselves to countries who do not share our values.
She goes on to say that solar panels are mostly manufactured over in China, which is true. They also take a shed load of coal to actually make, and it turns out that the carbon debt is never actually quite paid off, or it would take 70 years or something like that to actually make up for it. The whole share our values thing, that seems to be more a boomer thing. You get to younger people, they don't really care. But these things being manufactured abroad rather than in Britain really should make a lot of people basically scream and shout, why are we importing tertiary economic goods rather than getting the primary resources into Britain to get them manufactured here, which is pretty much where all the actual value comes from. And the answer is because we're a service industry, get stuffed. Although more specifically, it's because we have ridiculous regulations and massive energy costs. So what's Kemi Badenoch going to do about that? Not actually too sure yet. We've not had a plan so far, but to be fair to her, we have about, oh my god, there's 15 minutes. There's 20 minutes of this left to go. We're not going through all of it, don't worry. I'm skipping quite a bit, so let's keep going.
Those three truths are why I call myself a net zero skeptic. Muddled plans, unrealistic targets and deadlines, over-reliance on China. We have got to start acknowledging what is in plain sight. Net zero makes us dangerously dependent on countries who don't share our values, and it is risking our energy security.
Cool, fine. Yeah, Reform been talking about this for like a year, 2 years, probably longer. Go on, tell us, what's the plan then? What is the specific plan, Kemi Badenoch?
As part of our policy renewal, we are going to do something that Labour failed to do in 14 years of opposition. We are going to deal with reality.
That's the best you could do? That's the best you have? We're going to do what Labour didn't, deal with reality. Oh, okay. Why didn't you do it? I just love that phrasing. We're going to do what Labour didn't do for 14 years. While who was in power, exactly?
Confront the real problems, answer the real questions, and be ready with a plan.
Right, I'm done. That's it for Net Zero. I can't be bothered with it anymore. What's what's our policy renewal? We're going to come up with a plan a few years down the line. Great. How's that meaningfully different to Reform then? Oh, Reform don't mean it. Oh, but you have a 14-year track record of being against everything you've just said, so I don't know about that. Yeah, I'm just skipping the net zero stuff. Come on, what's the next topic?
I said at my party conference speech that we were going to rewire, reprogram, and reboot the way government works so it serves the public again.
My goodness, people go on about Reform being nothing but rhetoric, but what is this if not nothing but rhetoric? I mean, just from the net zero stuff alone, here are the problems, our plan is to look into them. Oh.
Tomorrow, my shadow cabinet will begin to do the same with many of the other problems that we see. Getting people back to work, dealing with a society that is fragmenting, not integrating, fixing healthcare, repairing the mess Labour are making right now in education, improving productivity, controlling immigration and dealing with the lawfare that stops elected officials from making democratic decisions.
Again, it's just one of those things that you have to constantly bring up. You've just copied Reform's homework there. That is everything they were complaining about last election. And sure, it only got them to about 14% in the polls, but clearly people were not ready to make the leap away from the Uniparty yet. Most people just didn't bother voting. And honestly, I don't really blame them, because Reform weren't particularly professionalised at that point, and a lot of them had paper candidates, and I think people realised that. They were absolutely just a protest vote at that point, but they are professionalising. It's going to be very different over the next few years with by-elections and local elections. And it's not exactly helping that you're basically here now copying their homework. People are going to notice that.
In the weeks ahead, I will say more on the academics, experts, business people, members from all walks of life who will help us get to the root cause of our country's problems.
Are you kidding me? This was all this was about? Whenever you have a Reform conference, it's usually big news about, 29 defections, or here's a massive candidate we're putting forward for a mayoral election. We just reached 200,000, let's reiterate our policies. This was supposed to be Kemi's big speech on how she's renewing the party, and all it basically is, oh, all these problems Reform have pointed out? Yeah, we'll look into them. Honestly, this is horrendous. This is painful to get through. You're lucky that I'm cutting out most of this speech.
Our party members shape our policy, and they will be at the heart of this. They joined the Conservative Party because they want to change the country for the better. Our policy renewal will be the foundation of making that happen for the next decade. And if you are not a Conservative Party member, but like what you hear, join us. We need your support, your help, your expertise.
Again, the thing crying out from me, why would I bother when you've just said everything Reform has been saying but a few months later, in fact years later? Why would anyone take this seriously? Reform, I've already seen Reform have the massive donors. I already see that they've got researchers going on. They're even trying to throw out policy there. That seems way better than what you're trying to do, which is effectively, we've got 4 years, we'll look into the problems. I'm sorry, you were in government for 14 years. You had all the time in the world to fix this stuff. Why would I take you seriously now? Anyway, that's pretty much everything interesting from the speech. I'll quickly go through the questions. If there are any that are particularly interesting, I'll go through them. If not, I'll delete that and just say the video's over instead.
What do you say? You've said you want to rip up this plan for getting to net zero by 2050, but you haven't said that although you support net zero, when you would like to get there. What do you say to those who say that if you've got no target, you've got no plan?
I suppose this is the other thing, actually, that this guy's pointed out. Kind of why are you only meeting Mr. Fun halfway, let's say? Clearly you're not against net zero as an overall good target, whereas you have Reform over there saying net zero is absolutely astoundingly moronic and we shouldn't even consider it a good plan. And now because you have no target, you have no plan. What do you say to that, Ms. Badenoch?
That's not how it works. You can't just pull targets out of the air. And what we did was pick a target and then start thinking of how to get there. We need to start thinking about it in a different way. How does this impact families? How is business going to help us deliver? And that's what the policy commissions are going to do. So
if nothing else, that has just proven that the Tory party still believe in net zero. They just think the target needs to be reviewed, let's say. Yeah, I'm not being funny. If you're right wing, the Tory party still isn't for you, frankly.
In government, you did support net zero targets. What has substantially changed since then? And I also want to ask you, it is not difficult to find colleagues of yours who think that you're failing to cut through as leader. Do you think those colleagues have underestimated you, or were you overestimated when the party picked you to be its leader?
I mean, I already made the point for net zero, so I'm just going to skip that. Yes, she was vocal about it, but it's party line, so whatever she says to that, I don't really care. And also, she largely voted against ridiculous environmental stuff, so fine. That second question, though, quite biting. Let's see what she says on that.
And I'm not going to pretend that I won't have critics. And it's not easy to find critics. This is politics. Being a politician is about being criticised. What I'm asking people to do is listen to what I'm saying. I am not doing what all the other parties are doing. We are changing the way we do things. The Conservative Party is under new leadership, and we have to make sure that we think things through and don't just give announcements without a proper plan to back them up.
Yeah, I don't think many people are going to be convinced by that, especially outside of the Tory party as it is now. Basically, every time I ask anyone I know in the Tories what they think of Kemi Badenoch, they either want to get off the subject quickly or they'll say, well, I voted Generic, so don't blame me. So I just wanted to point out that was the applause she got for saying, I am the new leader and we go in a different direction. As I said before, just half-hearted. This is not a good announcement from her. People will forget this happened in a week. I mean, I keep forgetting that Kemi Badenoch's leader of the Tories. That's how bad she is at the moment. I see Robert Generic in way more places. Then again, I'm online a lot more, and that's mostly where he's trying to get his popularity. But once again, I'm seeing nothing impressive from Kemi Badenoch, and going through this, I just feel embarrassed for her, to be honest. She'll be out next year, I guarantee it.
The aim of the 2050 net zero target is to stave off catastrophic climate change. By abandoning a target set by a Tory Prime Minister, aren't you simply trying to trump Reform UK, which also wants to scrap net zero, and stave off the threat to your party from Nigel Farage?
Just to be clear, they are not getting rid of net zero targets, they are just reviewing them. That is what Kemi Badenoch has said there, so it's not undermining them anyway.
There was no reform in 2019 when I first spoke about this. There was no reform in 2022.
Little bit disingenuous. Richard Tyson, Nigel Farage, two of the biggest names in Reform at the moment, were talking about it constantly. In fact, if Gawain Towell was supposed to be believed, they were saying this stuff basically back in the 90s, that environmental projects are just nuts. But they were keeping quiet about it because, effectively, you want to ride that wave and not get in front of it, otherwise you'll be one of the people forgotten about in history.
We do need to tackle climate change, but if a plan isn't working, we can't just keep bringing out a broken plan and saying we'll keep going on with it. Let's get a plan that works. Yes,
and you're just going to review it, blah, blah, blah. Reform's plan is basically just scrap the whole thing, which is probably a hell of a lot better for most people, I'm afraid. So, once again, just move to Reform. Anyway, most of the rest of the questions are just specifics about environmental policy and things like that largely she doesn't have too much of an answer to in terms of hard plans, as I say. This whole speech was just to say, trust us, we're going to look into all this and have a plan by the end of it, which, how that makes her any different from Reform, I guess. She does eventually want net zero and Reform don't. But when I hear that, I think, go vote Reform then. Anyway, as I say, lacklustre speech, really not an awful lot you can glean from it, to be honest with you, so that's why I'm not really wasting any more of your time. So that's where I'll leave it today. Chill time, there is a stream tonight where, oddly enough, it's on topic. Mercian over on the Worcester Club is going to have his lovely rant about electric vehicles and why they are terrible. That is 9 o'clock tonight, so do come along to that. And I only realised today that I won't be able to do Laughing at the Guardian next weekend, so we're doing an extra one this weekend, so do come along to that on Saturday. If you want to help out the channel, just subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment telling me what you think about Kemi Badenoch. I'm not expecting an awful lot of praise. But if you want to help out the channel more directly, super thanks and super chats on any stream or any video that I do. And also you can become a channel member and get access to all my previous streams. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today, so once again, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, goodbye.